Next in line, we actually have, I'll get my glasses on, WebEx, Matt Beienburg, and he's going to correct me, Director of Education Policy, Goldwater Institute. Welcome, Matt.
Can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify. Matt Beienburg, Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute. Here to speak in support of the bill, strongly support the concept of a Parent's Bill of Rights, and in particular, the provisions of this bill dealing with transparency and posting the list of materials online. These transparency measures are particularly important right now, given the proliferation of political materials through K-12 across the country in various subjects and grade levels. As mentioned, parents struggling to be able to actually see what's being taught in the classroom. To illustrate the extent of the problem, just to give you in the words of teachers themselves, as teachers have reported in the education journal Education Week, which describes itself as the education newspaper of record, excerpts such as, quote, "Keeping politics out of the classroom is like keeping the water out of rain. We must take up controversial issues like racism, sexism, inherently political topics such as gun control or climate change, and every teacher is a civics teacher." Members, in other words, many teachers see that they have a mandate to bring politics into the classroom, whether that's history, science, or math, and engage in a way that often leads students to a what they consider a more enlightened or woke worldview. The online transparency provisions in this bill would provide a mechanism for parents and ensure that political teaching does not happen in secret. As Ethics and Public Policy Center fellow Stanley Kurtz has written of similar provisions now being considered in state legislatures around the country, quote, "A vote against curriculum transparency, in particular these sorts of online posting measures, is a vote to keep the public in the dark, to shut out parents, and to allow teachers to politicize the classroom. K-12 curriculum transparency should henceforth be a top-tier issue for state legislators and governors everywhere, not above CRT in priority, but alongside it." Many of you are surely familiar with the New York Times 1619 Project, an academically discredited series of essays that attempts to rewrite and reframe American history. As Real Clear Politics investigation found, the 1619 Project has, quote, "been adopted in more than 3,500 classrooms in all 50 states. Even more significantly, and I think this captures the crux of why the provisions of this bill are so necessary, as the investigators found, the 1619 Project is, quote, "mostly being used as supplemental optional classroom teaching material. By and large, school systems are adopting the project by administrative fiat, not through a public textbook review process." Members, that essentially means that Kansas students across the state are having this material assigned to them, but that in nearly every case, the schools or teachers who are doing so without public discussion, without official school district governing board sign-off, and without meaningful parental awareness. Unfortunately, this problem is larger than the 1619 Project or critical race theory itself. As former teacher and American Enterprise Institute scholar Robert Pondicio has noted, quote, "States, districts, and school boards have less control over what gets in front of students than to Google, Pinterest, and the lesson sharing website Teachers Pay Teachers, the top 3 places teachers go when looking for materials." Teachers obviously should have the ability to supplement their lesson plans, but this freedom does not negate the rights of parents to know what is being taught in the public schools. Unfortunately, parents around the nation have had this right abridged. The Goldwater Institute right now, we're actually representing a parent from Rhode Island who simply wanted to know what curriculum would be used before enrolling her incoming kindergarten daughter. She was told by the school district not simply to talk to the teacher or the principal, but that she had to submit a formal public records request. When she did so, she was told she asked too many questions, was told it would cost thousands of dollars to obtain that information, and ultimately was threatened with litigation by her school board and had the National Education Association step in to attempt to block her access to those materials. At the same time that it's throwing up such barriers, that same organization, the National Education Association, has expressly called for infusing ideologies such as critical race theory into K-12 curriculum, declaring at its 2021 National Assembly, quote, "It is reasonable and appropriate for curriculum to be informed by academic frameworks, including critical race theory, and that the association, quote, will educate members on the tools and resources needed to defend honesty in education, including but not limited to tools like CRT." So given the routine denials from such groups that CRT is taught in our schools, which stands in sharp contrast even to the admissions of the NEA, and also the extensively documented examples of CRT throughout the nation, it's essential that parents be empowered to see for themselves and make that judgment about whether the content being presented to their students is political or appropriate. The provisions for academic transparency in front of you would accomplish this in a way that maximizes transparency while minimizing the additional requirements for teachers. Public school teachers already commonly document the resources that they're using by submitting lesson plans to principals or other administrators. In fact, as one union leader conceded in her testimony against similar legislation in Arizona, She said, quote, "I currently serve as the vice president of the Arizona Education Association. Weekly, I implement lesson plans. I submit them to my principal, to my coach, to the district office. This is because I'm a professional." And members, this bill simply recognizes that if teachers can disclose the materials within the school walls, there's no reason that information cannot also be made available to the public and to parents. In fact, various programs already exist to allow teachers to do this at the click of a button. Moreover, in terms of the impact for teachers, veteran teachers right now who have refined their syllabi over the years currently do not start from scratch each year. They tend to keep track of what materials they've used so that they can use those in the following year. So this information is largely already compiled, and complying with the provisions of the transparency posting in this bill would require minimal extra effort on top of that. More importantly, for new teachers, this transparency bill would actually help them. It would do so by helping them see what other teachers are doing so that they can model their instruction off of the best and most successful instructors around the state. In fact, rather than having to scour the internet and search for materials, again, they would be able to see what their peers are using. A nationwide survey, in fact, which sampled over 1,300 respondents out of a database of 200,000 educators, found that teachers themselves report spending over 4 hours every single week, quote, "searching for free instructional resources to use in my classroom." As those survey authors conclude, this enormous investment of time under the status quo is taking away, quote, "significant time from analyzing data, communicating with parents, and diagnosing specific student needs." Fortunately, the online provisions in this tool would actually reduce the amount of time that teachers have to spend doing that. Instead of having to search for Google and the internet, they can simply go and, again, see what other teachers are using. In fact, in North Carolina, when similar legislation made its way to their House of Representatives, one representative opposed the bill out of fear that teachers would be able to copy and see what others are doing. As she said, quote, "My concern is who gets credit for the lesson plans. I also think this would prompt people who are coming into the system, i.e. new teachers, to just search the website and grab the best lesson plans and turn them in." But members, we should be encouraging our teachers to build on each other's work, not spending time reinventing the wheel. As one teacher who testified to the North Carolina House of Representatives, which voted overwhelmingly in favor of similar legislation, put it, quote, "This is a great collaborative effort for teachers and educators to find other resources that are effectively being used across the state and posting those and making them available for their colleagues. As a former Wake County teacher, 20 years ago, I provided all this information. I turned in my lesson plans to my principal. Doing it electronically now would be so much simpler than what I was expected to do as a Wake County teacher. So all of this is stuff that I had to do as a teacher that now as a parent, I would greatly appreciate." Members, as that teacher noted, quote, "I was expected to get every single media piece that I used in my classroom pre-approved before I used it and shared it with my students." As already mentioned, however, this legislation does not require teachers to get their materials approved in advance or document them in advance. It does not limit their ability to adapt their lesson plans at any point or prevent them from finding new resources. So members, universities commonly already document their resources and their syllabi online, and parents in K-12 schools across the country, for example, at the Great Hearts Charter Schools, can currently go online and see the individual short stories and poems that students will expect to encounter. So as scholars such as Stanley Kurtz have put it, quote, "If you doubt that these transparency provisions are needed, recall that many teachers have promised to preach CRT to their students even if it violates the law. Indeed, already 4,000 teachers across the country, including educators in over a dozen cities and towns in Kansas, have publicly pledged to continue teaching their vision of racialized history, quote, regardless of the law. It's essential, therefore, that parents have the ability to see for themselves whether the materials being used in the classroom are appropriate." Members, more than 20 states across the country have now introduced legislation in the 2021-2022 legislative sessions containing provisions similar to the transparency posting before you. In several of those states, including Wisconsin, Indiana, North Carolina, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, the legislation has already passed one or both legislative chambers. So if you believe that parents have a right to know what sort of materials are being used in the classroom before they have to make an enrollment decision, or that teachers should be sharing materials as opposed to jealously guarding them to help promote the craft of their peers, I would strongly encourage you to support this legislation. Thank you very much for the chance to testify.
All right, thank you, Matt. We have about a minute. Is there a question? Representative Hoy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the testimony that you have provided, it says that teachers believe they have a mandate to connect with students, to open the eyes of students to a more woke worldview. Could you clarify what you mean by woke worldview?
Madam Chair, Representative, yes, I would say that that involved a broad set of highly politicized views that I think folks who has been described that parents have concerns about this being something that is pushing typically a very progressive, left-leaning, politicized view of materials rather than sticking to something that's more academic.
Representative Nguyen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so I'm going to follow up on that same line of thinking. We know now after 100 years, the Tulsa race massacre occurred and it's factual, and that community is taking ownership and teaching it to its children. How would you assess that?
Madam Chair, Representative, we fully support the teaching of history and of historical fact. I don't think that there is any, whatever the episode, whether it's slavery, the Holocaust, Tulsa, Indian removal, whatever instance, there is, I don't think anyone who would want to say we should be keeping students from learning about history. That's very different from teaching that, for instance, students should come to view each other based upon a lens of race or treat each other differently based upon race.
Okay, so your definition of whatever woke was that you provided is not limited to, or is not defined, or, I mean, you use the 1619 project, an example that would not be appropriate, correct? Did I misunderstand you?
Madam Chair, Representative, thank you for the question. So the 1619 project, again, as it has been disputed on factual grounds by scholars, folks such as Yale, Notre Dame, Princeton, scholars, historical scholars themselves have said this is factually inaccurate material. So in that sense, this is not simply covering a historical instance that would be objectionable. This is to say your presentation of the materials are questionable. And I think under this transparency bill, one of the advantages of that, fortunately, it does not actually, it essentially says what we're going to do is let parents know that it's being taught. And if they have concerns about that, they're able to engage, right? It doesn't even require the legislature stepping in on each piece of material and saying this is or is not appropriate. It empowers parents with that ability to say, yes, this school is teaching the 1619 project. It may not be part of the officially adopted curriculum, but it is being presented to students, and that's information that's of note to those parents.
And I would respectfully disagree that it is factual. However, the interpretation and how it then has been discussed in academia is perhaps what you would disagree with. But 1619 occurred, so that is not a fact that will be disputed. But thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony.
All right, committee, are there any other questions for Matt? We'll do one, it needs to be very quick. Representative Byers.
So given the discussion we've had here and in your reference about things along the lines of race, if I as a Native American stand in my classroom and then relate the story to my children, my students, about the fact that as a child I was refused service into a bathroom, would that fit under that definition? Would that be okay because it's historically accurate, or would I be biased because it actually happened to me?
Madam Chair, Representative, again, thank you for the question. So I'm speaking here in terms of the transparency proposals. So that doesn't even need to make a judgment in terms of any particular issue. It just says, let's have whatever materials are being presented to the students, which again, obviously there is vast disagreement in our country on a number of issues, but to say again, rather than trying to, in every single case, have the state adjudicate this particular piece, the transparency measure provides a degree of flexibility that says, we're not taking a statement on an individual material, but we don't think that this is something that should be done without then disclosing that to the parent. So I think to your question, the transparency approach provides a solution that regardless of one's viewpoint ensures that that information is made public to the parents.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Matt. We appreciate your testimony.